All right, students, I thought I'd start today with a little bit of a different slide introductory, right? Since the screen's a little different if you didn't notice. But today we're going to be talking about the use, misuse, and misunderstanding of research, an area that I find super interesting. So this lecture will focus on discussing ways that research is used, misused, and that leads people to misunderstand research, which is a big deal. I came from a market research background. I'll probably tell some stories of that during this. You can always email me if you're curious for more. All right, so let's get into this, shall we? So first off, misinformation and disinformation. So we're first going to define the two terms that have to do with research and being misunderstood and misinformation, right? So misinformation is when false or inaccurate information is mistakenly or inadvertently created or spread. While disinformation is when false information is deliberately created and spread in order to influence public opinion or obscure the truth. The important way to distinguish between the two is that for misinformation, the intent is not to deceive, while disinformation, the intent is to deceive. Research can be impacted by both misinformation and disinformation. For example, a news article may share information that comes from research article, right? But it is possible that they only share a limited quote from the article or one finding that does not accurately capture the bigger picture of what that study was about. For example, in 2018, many news sites shared articles with the headline, World Health Organization declares bacon is as harmful as smoking. This type of article title sounds alarming, especially because they mention a reputable organization, right? However, if you dive deeper, into the actual findings by the World Health Organization, they label processed meat as a group of one substance. Since tobacco is also labeled a group one substance, many assumed that this meant that the processed meat, such as bacon and cigarettes, were equally harmful. In reality, substances labeled as a group 1 are believed to potentially be a cause of cancer, but the group membership classification does not describe the strength of this or scientific evidence, meaning that these two substances belonging to the same group does not mean that bacon is as harmful as cigarettes. In fact, the World Health Organization even issued a statement that said due to the amount of misinformation that was spread online, in this instance, real evidence was misunderstood, and the information spread, leading many people to false information about this topic. And it's interesting because it panders into the self-fulfilling prophecy, where you can have something said, it wasn't true, and then it might become true, which then plays into an even more dilemma circumstance, right? But one thing I wanted to also mention that can be here is there's a concept, I don't know if you'll know it or not, you might, depending where you are on your journey in sociology, but it's called a kernel of truth. And this is where you see misinformation in how it can be worked, because you can utilize this and you can be able to foster moral panic through usages of kernels of truth through misinformation. If somebody you see as reputable say something and they don't tell all the information, how are you going to challenge it, or how are you going to know better? This is why you need to know what's dis and misinformation, and it's very important to do so. So remember, there's a difference: misinformation and disinformation. Here's the article, by the way. It'll be in your slides. So let's get to the type of misinformation and disinformation. So there are many types of misinformation and disinformation that can occur to misconstrue or understanding our research. As shown in the image on the slide, misinformation and disinformation occurs on a spectrum. This image displays misinformation at the left of the spectrum and disinformation on the right side of the spectrum. So this can be a useful tool for you. Starting with the misinformation slide of the spectrum is satire or parody. There are articles that are meant to make fun of topics using humor. However, if people aren't aware that a source is satire, then they may misunderstand the information and believe it's true. An example of this, if you haven't ever looked up the Onion articles, please look up the Onion articles. They are absolutely outlandish. But even myself, sometimes when I post things on social media, I have students who follow in a sociology account that I have, the Sociology Cat. And I'll post an article from the Onion, and if I don't remember to put LOL or something, I worry that they're taking my information that I post as accuracy. So also worry about the voice that you're leading, right? So this can be a good tool for you. Satire, parody, misleading content, imposter content, fabricated content, false connection, false context, manipulated content. Please be aware of this. So when we get from here, right, we're looking at this, for example, The Onion published an article titled, Study Finds Over 5 Million Birds Die Annually from Head-On Collision with Clouds. The article states that the findings come from a study from the University of Connecticut. To someone unfamiliar with satire, it may seem like this article is disseminating information from a real research article. But that article is only meant to be humorous and not factual. This is why it's important to investigate the sources research we consume so we aren't misled by these satirical posts.
The
So,
next cat
so it becomes super important for us that the next category in the spectrum is false connections. This is when the headline or visuals these false visuals, right? So it becomes very important for us to focus in to someone familiar and how it will be. But the next category, not with just the false connections, this is when headlines or visuals don't match up to the content of the article. This type of misinformation is common on social media sites like Facebook, where we diffuse a lot of media information. You may see someone share an article with a headline, and then when you click on the article and read it, the article doesn't actually back up what is said in the headline. This causes widespread information, especially when people are now sharing news articles with sensitization headlines, which actually about actually reading the article, right? How many people have you met who have read like a sentence of an article and sent it, right? Or watched 14 seconds of a or 45-second TikTok? But what if you trust that person, right? So instead, it talks about how adults need as much calcium as previously suggested. This is why really important to evaluate the sources before sharing the information, as it can lead to misinformation being spread intentionally or unintentionally. Now, the next step here, right, is that the category is misleading content, right? This is when misleading information is used to discuss an issue. The example we previously discussed, comparing bacon to cigarettes, is an example of misleading content. As the headline described, bacon and cigarettes as being equally dangerous, when in reality, this information was misleading because the study did not find that these two were equally dangerous, just that they're both classified in the same group of substance. The false context category that falls right in the middle between misinformation and disinformation is when real content is shared, but it's shared with a false contextual information. An example of this would be when ABC News shared an article that stated over 100 fully vaccinated people contracted COVID-19 in Washington state. Although this headline technically shares accurate information, my apologies, I want to make sure the article's out there for you. Accurate information. They wanted this headline The way this headline is worded is it makes it sound like the vaccines are not working properly to prevent COVID-19. However, the larger context is added. The meaning of this headline changes. The truth was that out of 1.2 million fully vaccinated folks, only 100 contracted COVID-19. So it changes, as you see. When this additional information is added, it changes the tone of the headline and demonstrates that the vaccines have largely been effective, as only a small number of those vaccinated contracted COVID-19. ABC later changed the headline to make the context of the article clear. This is an example of why it's important to understand the context surrounding the information that we are consuming. So, as we continue down this line, right? The next three types of information intended to deceive individuals, and for these reasons, they are classified as disinformation. Imposter content is genuine sources are impersonated. We may see this as websites that look like popular news sites but are not actual news sites, or on social media when people create accounts that impersonate others. Information shared from these sources can seem like they are coming from credible sources when they're actually not coming from one of those. For example, during the pandemic, an unknown source used the letterhead from the Center of Disease Control and sent letters out to people claiming that CDC advises against wearing masks. This did not actually come from the CDC, but appeared like it did. This was imposter content because they were attempting to impersonate real sources to spread disinformation. The last two types of disinformation are manipulated content and fabricated content. This is when some or all of the information presented were manipulated or false with the intent to deceive people. One of the biggest examples with this regards to research in Andrew Wakefield's study on vaccines and autism. The last two types, of autism, his study claimed that vaccines cause autism. This study was originally published in the respected medical journal, and numerous news outlets picked up the story and spread the information. It was later discovered that the researcher used false data in his paper and that he, in fact, had no evidence that vaccines caused autism. Andrew Wakefield was even stripped of his medical license for fabricating this information. However, by the time it was discovered that medical license was taken, right, that the study was fabricated, news of his false findings had spread far and wide, leading many to believe his false conclusion that vaccines cause autism. This is one example of how disinformation can be dangerous, as many people may be deceived to believe false information, and this can have serious consequences, especially this case world, right? It impacted many parents' medical decisions for their children. All the types of misinformation and disinformation show why it's really important to carefully evaluate information we read. Now, I wanted to give you a little bit of context here. So let me go back to the slide here. So I get to deal with a lot of students and a lot of stories and a lot of things shared. And I wanted to give you an interesting two examples here. The first is when we're talking about the idea of misinformation and the way it can build this type of foundational sense of understanding when it's not really necessarily true, but it leads someone to believe it and becomes something said in a challenge. I teach dating, relationships, and marriage, and in that class, you have a lot of people from different disciplines. So it's not just a liberal arts class that's going to have one more consistent guideline. I teach deviance, which has that too. And in the class, we were talking about heterosexual relationships and homosexual relationships, and divorce rates, abuse rates, and all these different variables. And a student raised their hand very, very optimistically in their own mind. And I was curious, so I called the student, and they went off on this long tangential conversation about how lesbian relationships have the highest in-group violence rate. And then they talked about the divorce rates and all the things that they had read at these articles, and they talked about how they had read it from a academic source. And that's the old joke. They say that it's probably TikTok, but I knew what they were talking about. So there was a study done, and what they were alluding to was when they did a sampling of domestic abuse inside relationships, and this person is a male and was a white. He said he was straight. So like a lot of the voice right now around toxic masculinity was probably making him feel like he wanted to stand up for himself. But they did this longitudinal study where they looked at people who identified as being lesbian and other sexual orientations, but specifically in this area, lesbian. And this article had been written in a way that if you didn't dive deeper into the research, what you're learning how to do, it would have actually looked like this is what the article was saying, because they didn't change the different confounding variables towards the end. And what it reported was that those higher in-group rates of violence had also been tabulated because they included abuse rates from those who I now identify as lesbian, who had had hetero-facing relationships in the past. And actually, the study showed that the women had been in abusive relationships in the past ended up more consistently, which showed significance when it was with males, not with females. So it's not that the student was wrong, it was misinformation, and he didn't understand the study. And I'm sure he had shared that article with quite a few people, and if he had shared it with someone who knew how to do research like you're doing, they would have been able to challenge it. Now, when we look at disinformation, spreading it with the intention to cause harm, my area of research is the troubled teen industry. I look into congregate care facilities located throughout the entirety of the United States. I don't look at the internationals just yet. And I look at the history of them. I interview the family members pre and post, and I look at social networks and trust. And one of the things that's a powerful conversation is during the 1980s. Ask your parents if you want them to tell you about it, but there was a satanic panic that went around heavy rock and roll music, right? And what ended up being a thing inside these communities was that they believed that there was this rise in teen violence and teen aggression and drug use around and satanic engagement and rituals tied to rock music. So one of the locations that I have studied into in the troubled teen industry was called The Seed. It was reputable by people like one of our former president's wives who wrote about her life. But during that craze of the 80s panic and satanic panic, they put an ad out because of the rise of people's fear of drug abuse. Look at the idea of HIV and AIDS, look at the idea of crack and cocaine epidemic, all these things. And they had said that if you don't want your children to be drug addicts or violent offenders or Satanists, send your children into the Seed, which was a program meant to deal with what would be deemed as troubled children. So many children who were sent in during that time period, the 80s and 90s, were sent there to prevent them from becoming deviant or troubled, right? Not the goal of helping them with non-normative behavior. And this was disseminated out through the news saying that this was happening, and you start seeing increased numbers being sent into institutions that are meant to work with those who have non-normative behaviors, and a lot of abuse happened. It's very powerful. And I said earlier that there were some fun ways to look at this, right? When we think of articles, there's a lot of things called correlation and causation. When Britney Spears released the song Work, actually unemployment went down, sorry. I said earlier in the last lecture, when Nicolas Cage movies release, for some reason, there's a higher consistency of drownings. None of these means that they're actually accurate, but they're things people spread out there, like the Onion articles, ways that people disseminate interesting information of when there is numeric identicalness inside sampling, but it doesn't mean that there's correlation and causation. But that brings us to the end of our lecture, and I will see you in the next one, y'all.